The rise, the fall, the legacy.
For nearly 4 decades, one of the world's strangest McDonald's restaurants refused to disappear. Long after Expo '86 ended, long after its customers stopped coming, and long after countless redevelopment plans failed, McBarge remained, floating quietly on the Fraser River. To some people, it was a forgotten landmark. To others, it was simply an eyesore that should have been removed years ago. But regardless of opinion, there was something fascinating about it. A floating McDonald's that had somehow survived decades after its purpose had vanished. Today, however, the story has taken a darker turn. The structure sits partially submerged in the water, abandoned once again and facing perhaps its most uncertain chapter yet. This is the story of McBarge and how one of Canada's most unusual attractions slowly drifted toward disaster. Our story begins in 1986. Vancouver was preparing to host Expo '86, a major international exposition expected to attract millions of visitors from around the world. Events like these often become showcases for innovation, architecture, and ambitious ideas. Companies spend enormous amounts of money trying to stand out, hoping to leave a lasting impression on visitors. McDonald's wanted to do exactly that. Rather than building a traditional restaurant on land, the company approved a much more unusual concept. They would construct a floating McDonald's restaurant. Officially known as Friendship 500, the structure was built on a large barge and positioned along Vancouver's waterfront. The project celebrated a significant milestone for the company, while also serving as one of Expo '86's most memorable attractions. Visitors arriving at the exposition could hardly miss it. Sitting directly on the water, it looked unlike any McDonald's location they had ever seen before. Families visited out of curiosity. Tourists took photographs. Crowds lined up for the experience. For a few short months, the concept worked exactly as intended. During the exposition, McBarge became a genuine success. It attracted thousands of customers and generated widespread publicity. More importantly, it accomplished what every company hopes to achieve at events like Expo '86. People remembered it. In a fair filled with futuristic exhibits and international attractions, a floating McDonald's somehow managed to stand out. But there was one problem. Expo '86 was never intended to last forever. When the exposition ended later that year, many attractions were dismantled and removed. McBarge remained behind. Suddenly, the floating restaurant faced a difficult reality. Without Expo visitors, its purpose was far less clear. Keeping the structure in its original location proved challenging, particularly as plans emerged to redevelop large portions of Vancouver's waterfront. Local officials had different visions for the area, and a floating fast food restaurant was not necessarily part of those plans. As discussions continued, the restaurant remained closed. Months turned into years. The crowds disappeared, the lights stayed off, and one of the most unique McDonald's locations ever built became an expensive problem. Eventually, the structure was relocated away from its original home. What followed would become the most famous chapter of its story. Not its years as a restaurant, but its years as an abandoned landmark. Most abandoned structures gradually fade from public memory. They are demolished, redeveloped, or forgotten altogether. McBarge was different. Its unusual appearance kept people interested. Photographers documented it. Urban explorers became fascinated by it. Locals continued telling stories about the strange floating McDonald's sitting quietly on the water. Ironically, the longer it remained abandoned, the more famous it became. As years passed, different owners explored possible futures for the structure. Some envisioned restaurants, others imagined entertainment venues, museums, or commercial developments. Yet every proposal seemed to encounter obstacles. Funding proved difficult. Government approvals took time. Suitable locations were hard to secure. Nothing moved forward quickly enough to save the structure from gradual deterioration. Despite these challenges, optimism remained. Many people believed McBarge could still be transformed into something meaningful. Among the strongest supporters of preservation was developer Howard Meakin. Unlike others who viewed the structure primarily as real estate, Meakin saw it as an important piece of local history. He believed the floating restaurant deserved a second chance. Throughout the years, several redevelopment concepts emerged. One of the most ambitious involved converting the former restaurant into a deep ocean discovery center. Instead of serving hamburgers and fries, the structure would educate visitors about ocean exploration, marine science, and underwater technology. The idea attracted attention and generated excitement. For a moment, it seemed possible that McBarge might finally escape decades of uncertainty. Unfortunately, reality proved more complicated. Major redevelopment projects require significant funding, strong partnerships, and long-term planning. Progress moved slowly. Construction never truly began. The years continued passing. Meanwhile, the structure itself continued aging. Exposure to weather gradually took its toll. Rain, wind, and changing temperatures slowly damaged the exterior. Paint faded. Rust spread across sections of the structure. Windows deteriorated. Areas requiring maintenance became increasingly expensive to repair. Every year that passed made restoration more difficult and more costly. By the early 2020s, McBarge once again found itself trapped in limbo. Plans still existed. Hope still remained. But visible progress was difficult to see. The structure sat waiting for a future that never seemed to arrive. Then came the event many feared would eventually happen. By 2025, reports describing the condition of McBarge had become increasingly concerning. Observers noted visible deterioration and signs that maintenance challenges were growing more serious. The structure appeared vulnerable. Yet despite these warnings, few people expected what happened next. In March 2025, McBarge began taking on water. What had survived for nearly 4 decades suddenly faced its greatest crisis. The floating restaurant partially sank. Images quickly spread through news outlets and social media. The sight was shocking. For years, people had become accustomed to seeing McBarge sitting quietly on the water. Now, large portions of the structure were submerged beneath the river's surface. Almost overnight, the famous floating McDonald's transformed into a wreck. The situation became even more tragic just weeks later, when Howard Meakin passed away. The developer who had spent years attempting to preserve and redevelop McBarge was suddenly gone. For many observers, the timing felt heartbreaking. The individual most committed to saving the structure would never see his vision realized. Today, McBarge remains partially submerged. Broken windows, damaged exterior sections, and decades of neglect are now impossible to ignore. Much of the structure rests below the waterline. Its future remains uncertain. Questions regarding ownership, responsibility, cleanup costs, and preservation continue to complicate the situation. For now, the floating restaurant remains trapped between history and disappearance. In many ways, McBarge was never just a McDonald's restaurant. It became a symbol of a different era. a time when companies experimented with unusual ideas and weren't afraid to take risks. It represented a brief moment when a floating fast food restaurant seemed like a perfectly reasonable attraction for a World's Fair. For decades, that strange idea captured people's imagination. Long after it stopped serving food, McBarge continued attracting photographers, explorers, historians, and curious visitors. Few abandoned structures remain relevant for so long. Even fewer become cultural icons. Personally, I think that's what makes McBarge such a fascinating story. Not because it was a McDonald's, not because it floated, but because it survived. Somehow, against all odds, it remained part of the landscape for nearly 40 years. Most temporary attractions disappear shortly after their purpose ends. McBarge refused to do that. Whether it is eventually removed, preserved, or left to slowly decay, its place in Canadian history is already secure. Even today, partially submerged and heavily damaged, it continues attracting attention from people around the world. Because sometimes the most memorable landmarks aren't the ones that succeed. They're the ones that refuse to be forgotten. And few places embody that better than McBarge.